Jonathan was 60 years old, a man whose entire existence was etched into the deep, weather-beaten lines of his face and the permanent calluses on his thick, steady hands. He was a farmer, but to those who knew him in the small, dust-blown village where he lived, he was much more. He was a monument to endurance. For over 40 years, Jonathan had woken up long before the sun dared to touch the horizon, pulling on a pair of boots that had been patched so many times they were more thread and dried mud than leather. His routine was as rhythmic and unyielding as the seasons, the sharpening of the scythe, the low murmur of a prayer for rain, and the relentless bowing of his back against the earth. To an outsider, Jonathan's life might have looked like a tragedy of endless toil. He lived in a modest wooden house where the porch groaned under the slightest weight and the roof leaked whenever the autumn storms grew too violent. He ate sparingly, often surviving on little more than boiled vegetables and bread, and his clothes were a patchwork of various shades of faded blue and gray. However, Jonathan did not see himself as a poor man. He possessed a secret wealth that he kept tucked away in a weathered tin box beneath his floorboards, a collection of every single spare penny he had managed to squeeze from the soil for the last 2 decades. He wasn't saving for a new tractor, a sturdier roof, or a comfortable retirement. He was saving for David. David was Jonathan's only son, the pride of his heart, and the sole reason the old man found the strength to straighten his spine each morning. From the moment David was born, Jonathan had made a silent, solemn vow to the heavens. His son would never know the bone-deep exhaustion of the fields. He would not be a man of the dirt. He would be a man of the mind. Jonathan saw in David a spark of intelligence and ambition that the village could never contain. He wanted David to walk on polished marble floors, not muddy furrows, and to wear silk ties instead of burlap sacks. "Study hard, my boy," Jonathan would whisper at night, his voice raspy from inhaling harvest dust, as David sat by the dim light of a kerosene lamp doing his homework. "The world is wide, and it is waiting for someone with your brain. Don't look at my hands. Look at your books. That is where your future lies." When the time came for David to go to the university in the distant, shimmering city, the cost was staggering, more than the value of Jonathan's entire livestock. Many in the village shook their heads, warning the old farmer that he was pouring his lifeblood into a dream that might never return to him. But Jonathan only smiled his slow, patient smile. He sold his best cattle, took on extra work laboring for the wealthier landowners nearby, and tightened his belt until it felt like he was barely breathing. He watched with tears of joy as David boarded the bus to the city, carrying a suitcase filled with the only new clothes the family had bought in years. For the first few years, the sacrifice felt easy. David would send letters home describing the tall glass buildings, the libraries that smelled of old wisdom, and the brilliant people he met. Jonathan would read these letters until the ink faded, imagining his son moving through those grand spaces like a prince returning to his kingdom. Every month, without fail, Jonathan would walk to the post office to wire a portion of his earnings. He didn't just send tuition. He sent money for David's rent, for his meals, for the expensive textbooks, and for the clothes David said he needed to fit in with the city elite. Jonathan grew thinner. His joints began to ache with a dull, persistent fire that never quite went out, and his hair turned as white as the cotton he harvested. He began to skip meals more frequently, telling himself he wasn't hungry, while his mind calculated exactly how many more bushels of corn it would take to cover David's final exams. He was an architect of a life he would never lead, building a pedestal for his son out of his own flesh and bone. As David reached his final year of study, however, the letters began to change. They became shorter, typed instead of handwritten, and filled with mentions of opportunities and networks that Jonathan didn't quite understand. David stopped asking about the farm. He stopped asking about the health of the old dog or the status of the winter wheat. The inquiries about Jonathan's own well-being became a formality, a single sentence at the end of a request for more funds. Yet, Jonathan's devotion remained unshaken. He told himself that David was simply busy with the weight of greatness. The city was a fast-moving machine, he reasoned, and David had to run twice as fast just to stay on top of it. If his son was becoming a city man, then it was only natural that he would leave the simple thoughts of the farm behind. Jonathan took pride in that distance. It was proof that his mission was succeeding. David was no longer a farm boy. The day David graduated, Jonathan had planned to travel to the city to see him walk across the stage. He had saved for months for the train ticket and had even tried to brush the permanent stains from his one good suit. But a week before the ceremony, David called. The call was brief, crackling with the static of a long-distance line. "Dad, it's better if you don't come," David had said, his voice sounding clipped and polished, devoid of the soft vowels of the countryside. "It's a very formal event. Very high society. You'd be bored, honestly. And the travel is too much for your back. Just stay there and celebrate for me. I'll send photos." Jonathan had hung up the phone and sat in the silence of his kitchen for a long time. The A-grade suit sat on the chair next to him, smelling of mothballs and hope. For a fleeting moment, a cold draft seemed to blow through the house, even though the windows were shut. It was a feeling of profound. But Jonathan pushed the feeling down. He told himself David was right. He was an old man of the earth, and he didn't belong in a room full of scholars and senators. He convinced himself that David's refusal to have him there was actually a gesture of protection, an act of love to save his father the embarrassment of being out of place. He went back to work the next morning with a renewed, almost desperate vigor. If he couldn't be there to witness the success, he would work even harder to fund the next stage of it. He was 60 now, and the farm was demanding more than his body wanted to give, but Jonathan had one last dream to build. David wanted to start a company. He wanted to be a leader, a CEO, a man who gave orders instead of taking them. And Jonathan, the humble farmer with the patched boots and the leaking roof, was determined to give him the world, even if it meant he had nothing left for himself. He was a man who believed in family with a purity that bordered on the divine, unaware that the foundation he had sacrificed everything to build was already beginning to crack under the weight of his son's cold, city-bred shame. The transition from university to the corporate world was marked by a silence that grew heavier with every passing season. Jonathan, now 62, found himself checking the dusty telephone on the kitchen wall with a frequency that bordered on obsession. The calls from David, once a weekly occurrence, had dwindled into monthly check-ins that lasted barely a minute. David's voice always sounded rushed, breathless with the frantic energy of the city, and crowded by the noise of traffic or the clinking of glasses in the background. He was always just about to step into a meeting or heading to a dinner with investors. Jonathan would barely have time to mention the health of the crops before the line went dead, leaving him alone with the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Despite the growing distance, Jonathan's pride remained his armor. He told the other villagers that David was simply being groomed for greatness, that the weight of a city career required a man to focus entirely on the horizon ahead rather than the dirt behind. But the farm was beginning to tell a different story. Without the extra hands David was supposed to provide, the fences began to sag, and the weeds grew taller in the corners of the fields. Jonathan worked until his vision blurred, his body moving with a stiff, mechanical persistence that ignored the warning screams from his lower back and knees. Then came the call that changed everything. It arrived late on a Tuesday evening, the sky a bruised purple over the fields. David didn't sound rushed this time. He sounded desperate. He spoke of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to launch his own logistics firm, a company that would revolutionize how the city moved. But there was a catch, a final, insurmountable wall. He needed capital. He needed a sum of money that Jonathan could barely comprehend, a figure that represented the entirety of his life's work and then some. "If I don't get this fund, Dad, I lose everything I've worked for," David pleaded, his voice cracking with a theatrical vulnerability. "The office space, the contracts, my reputation, it all goes away. I just need one last push from you. I'll pay it back tenfold within the year, I promise." Jonathan sat at his small wooden table, his rough fingers tracing the deep grooves in the grain. He thought of the tin box beneath the floorboards, the safety net he had built penny by agonizing penny. He thought of his own failing health, the roof that needed replacing, and the cold winters that were becoming harder to endure. But more than that, he thought of the silent vow he had made decades ago. He could not let his son fail at the very edge of the finish line. The next morning, Jonathan did something he never thought he would do. He walked to the local bank and signed over the title to his land as collateral for a loan. He combined that loan with every cent from the tin box and wired it all to David's city account. He felt a strange lightness as he walked home, the lightness of a man who has given away his last anchor. He was 63 years old, and for the first time in his life, he truly owned nothing but the air in his lungs. "It's for the company," he whispered to the empty fields, trying to convince himself that the hollow ache in his chest was excitement rather than fear. He's a CEO now. In the months that followed, the silence became absolute. The money had been sent, but the thank you call never came. Jonathan sent letters, but they were never answered. He called, but the calls went straight to a professional-sounding voicemail. The villagers began to whisper, their eyes filled with a pity that Jonathan found harder to bear than the physical labor. He retreated further into himself, working the land that technically no longer belonged to him, living on little more than watery soup and the hope that he would see David again. By the time David's 30th birthday approached, Jonathan was a shadow of his former self. His clothes hung loosely on his skeletal frame, and he moved with a slow, painful, deliberate pace. But his heart remained stubborn. He decided that he would not spend this milestone alone. He would go to the city. He would surprise David, not to ask for the money back or to complain about his hardships, but simply to see the man he had built. He wanted to witness the CEO in his natural habitat, to see the polished marble floors he had sacrificed his own floorboards to provide. He spent 2 days preparing. He cleaned his patched boots until they shone as much as worn leather could. He ironed his moth-eaten suit and packed a small, wooden carving he had made, a replica of the farm's old oak tree, the place where David used to play as a child. It was a humble gift, but Jonathan had carved it with a love that no city store could sell. The train ride was long and jarring, the vibration rattling his aching bones. As the green fields gave way to concrete canyons and towering pillars of steel and glass, Jonathan felt a mounting sense of vertigo. This world was louder and colder than he had imagined. People moved in blur, their faces buried in glowing screens, their shoulders tensed with a perpetual hurry. He stood on the sidewalk outside David's corporate headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds, feeling like an ant at the foot of a mountain. He clutched his small, brown paper-wrapped gift and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was vast, echoing with the sound of heels on granite. The air conditioning was so sharp it felt like a winter wind, reminding him of the night everything he believed about family began to dissolve. He approached the sleek reception desk, his presence drawing curious, almost repulsed glances from the young, impeccably dressed staff. "I'm here to see David," Jonathan said, his voice sounding small and gravelly in the grand hall. The receptionist looked at his worn suit and his calloused, dirt-stained hands with a mixture of confusion and disdain. "Do you have an appointment? Mr. David is very busy today. It's his birthday, and we're hosting a luncheon for the board." "I'm his father," Jonathan said simply, a flicker of his old pride returning to his eyes. The receptionist hesitated, then made a quick call. Minutes later, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and David stepped out. He looked magnificent, a man of silk and gold, his hair styled to perfection, his aura radiating power and success. But as his eyes landed on the old man standing by the desk, his expression did not soften with relief or joy. It froze into a mask of pure, icy horror. David didn't move toward him. He didn't open his arms for a hug. Instead, he looked around frantically at the group of investors who were standing nearby, waiting for him. Jonathan saw the moment the decision was made. The moment David looked at the father who had given him everything and saw only an embarrassment to be managed. David walked over, his step stiff, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you doing here? I told you not to come to the city." "It's your birthday, David," Jonathan whispered, holding out the wooden carving. "I just wanted to see you. I brought you a gift." Just then, a tall, elegantly dressed man in the group of investors called out, "David, is everything all right? Who is this gentleman?" David turned back to them, his face flushing a deep, shameful red. He forced a tight, artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes that were now as cold as the storm that breaks a man's spirit. "Oh, him," David said, his voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, dripping with a casual, cruel indifference. "He's just a servant from back home. He looks after my father's old estate in the country. He's just here to deliver some old documents. Take the package and head back, okay?" The lobby seemed to grow impossibly quiet for Jonathan. The gift in his hand suddenly felt like a heavy stone, a piece of dead wood that had no place in this world of glass and lies. He looked into his son's eyes and saw no trace of the boy who used to sit by the kerosene lamp. He saw only a stranger who had erased him from his life. Jonathan didn't cry. He didn't argue. He simply stood there in his moth-eaten suit, the silence of the betrayal echoing louder than any scream. The silence that followed David's words in the gleaming marble lobby was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the hum of the city and the rhythmic chime of the elevators. Jonathan stood perfectly still, his calloused hand still outstretched, offering the small wooden carving that was now nothing more than an object of ridicule. The investors chuckled softly at David's explanation, their eyes sliding over the servant with the casual indifference one might afford a piece of outdated furniture. David did not look back at him. He was already turning his shoulder, ushering his prestigious guests toward the private dining room, his silk suit catching the light like armor. Jonathan's arm dropped slowly to his side. He did not shout, and he did not plead. There was no explosion of anger, only a profound, hollow quietness that settled deep into his bones. The old farmer turned around, his patched boots squeaking softly on the polished granite floor, and walked back out through the revolving doors. The city air hit him like a physical blow, loud and frantic, but Jonathan moved through it like a ghost. He walked to the train station, his movements mechanical, and sat on a hard wooden bench for hours waiting for the late-night departure. In his lap, he held the wooden carving of the oak tree. He looked at the intricate lines he had spent nights perfecting, and for the first time, he saw them for what they were, a relic of a past that his son had discarded. The train ride home was a blur of darkness and reflection. As the towering steel of the city faded and the familiar, rolling silhouettes of the countryside returned, Jonathan felt a shift occur within him. For 60 years, his identity had been defined by what he could provide for David. He was the father, the provider, the sacrifice. He had erased his own needs, his own comforts, and his own future to build a kingdom for a boy who had just introduced him as a servant. By the time the train pulled into the small village station, the sun was beginning to touch the horizon, casting a pale, honest light over the fields. Jonathan walked the long path back to the farm, but his stride was different. The weight in his chest hadn't disappeared, but it had hardened into a singular, icy resolve. He entered his house, the house that was now technically owned by the bank because of the loan David had begged for, and sat at his kitchen table. He looked at the empty tin box that had once held 20 years of survival. He looked at the leaking roof and the sagging porch. No more, he whispered to the empty room. The decision was not made out of spite, but out of a sudden, desperate need for survival. He realized that David was no longer his responsibility because David had chosen to be a man without a father. If David was a CEO who could command a lobby full of investors, then David was a man who no longer needed a farmer's pennies. Jonathan went to the bank that morning. He spoke with the manager, a man who had known him for decades. He explained that he could no longer make the full interest payments on the loan David had consumed. He made a deal to sell the furthest 10 acres of his land, the richest soil he owned, to settle the immediate debt and reclaim the title to his house and the remaining garden. It was a painful amputation of his legacy, but it bought him his freedom. From that day forward, the monthly wires stopped. The extra labor for the wealthy landowners stopped. Jonathan stopped skipping meals. He began to use his meager earnings to repair his own life. He patched the roof properly, reinforced the porch, and bought a new coat that actually kept the winter chill away. He began to plant a small garden of herbs and flowers, things that were meant for beauty and his own enjoyment, rather than just bushels of grain for profit. The silence from the city continued, but it no longer felt heavy. Every time the phone rang, Jonathan looked at it and felt nothing. He was no longer waiting for a thank you that would never come. He lived quietly, his joints still aching but his mind finally clear. He found a strange peace in the dirt under his fingernails, knowing that this time, he was planting for a harvest he would actually get to eat. 3 years passed in this quiet, self-sustained rhythm. Jonathan grew older, but he also grew stronger in spirit. He became a fixture in the village again, known for his wisdom and his steady, peaceful demeanor. He had accepted that he would likely never see his son again, and he was at peace with that. The son he loved had died in that marble lobby, and the man who remained in the city was a stranger Jonathan no longer felt obligated to know. Then, on a cold, gray afternoon that smelled of approaching snow, a car appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a sleek city limousine. It was a battered, mud-splattered sedan that coughed as it climbed the hill toward the farmhouse. Jonathan was on his porch, rocking slowly in a chair he had recently fixed. He watched as the car came to a rattling halt at the end of the driveway. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was thin, painfully so, and his clothes were wrinkled and stained. There was no silk tie, no gold watch, and no aura of power. David walked toward the porch, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in the same way the villagers' shoulders slumped after a failed harvest. He looked like a man who had been erased by the very world he had tried so hard to impress. Greed, overexpansion, and the fickle nature of city friends had finally done what Jonathan's warnings never could. The farmhouse kitchen was filled with the aroma of vegetable stew, a scent that David had once associated with a life he desperately wanted to escape. He sat at the same small wooden table where he had once spent nights studying by kerosene light, but he did not look like the confident man who had dominated the city skyscraper. His hands, once soft and manicured, were shaking as he gripped the spoon, and his expensive city suit was now nothing more than a collection of dirty, useless rags. He ate with a frantic, animalistic hunger, the silence of the room punctuated only by the sound of the wind rattling the windows. Jonathan sat across from him, sipping a cup of herbal tea from his own garden. He watched his son with a calm, steady gaze that David found deeply unsettling. There was no pity in Jonathan's eyes, nor was there the burning anger David had expected. Instead, there was a profound neutrality, the look of a man who was observing a stranger passing through his territory. I can't believe they did it to me, Dad, David whispered, his voice trembling as he finally set the spoon down. The partners, the board, as soon as the first contract fell through, they turned on me. They stripped the company, took the accounts, and left me with the debt. I had to sell the apartment, the cars, everything. Jonathan stayed silent, his rough fingers tracing the rim of his cup. I tried calling Rachel, my friends. No one answered. David continued, a sob catching in his throat. I walked for miles because I didn't even have money for a bus. I thought about what I said to you in that lobby. I was so arrogant. I was so ashamed of where I came from that I became a monster. Can you ever forgive me? Jonathan set his tea down with a soft click against the wood. He leaned back in his chair, the reinforced joints of the furniture holding firm, just like the new foundation of his life. Forgiveness is a word people in the city use when they want to clear their conscience without doing the work, Jonathan said, his voice gravelly but resonant. You didn't just insult me that day, David. You erased the 20 years of labor I gave to put you in that room. You told the world I was a servant, and in doing so, you made yourself a man without a father. You got exactly what you asked for. David looked down at his empty bowl, the shame radiating from him in waves. I know. I'm a failure. But I'm home now. I'll help you with the farm. We can build it back together, just like you always wanted. Jonathan offered a slow, sad smile. The farm I always wanted is gone, David. I sold the 10-acre plot to pay off the loan you begged for. This house is small now. The livestock is gone. I only grow enough for myself. Then I'll work for the neighbors. I'll do whatever it takes. David pleaded, reaching across the table to touch Jonathan's hand. Jonathan didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze back either. You don't understand. I didn't just lose the land. I lost the reason to be a provider. I spent my life making sure you wouldn't have to touch the dirt, and you used that gift to look down on the man who gave it to you. If I take you back now, if I let you stay here and hide from your mistakes, I am failing you all over again. The fire in the stove crackled, casting long shadows across the walls. David looked around the room, seeing the repairs Jonathan had made. The sturdy porch, the fixed roof, the organized shelves. He saw a man who had learned to be happy without him. What am I supposed to do? David asked, his voice a broken rasp. You will sleep in your old bed tonight, Jonathan said firmly. It is a warm bed, and you will have a full stomach. But tomorrow morning, when the sun touches the horizon, you must leave. David gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. You're kicking me out? In the winter? Dad, I have nothing. You have exactly what I had when I started 60 years ago, Jonathan replied, his voice as unyielding as the winter earth. You have your hands, and you have your breath. You wanted to be a man of high society, a man of power. Now, you must learn to be a man of character. You must find a way to survive on your own merit, not on the blood of an old man. David began to cry openly, the sound echoing through the house he had once considered a prison and now saw as his last sanctuary. Jonathan did not move to comfort him. He stood up and began to clear the table, his movements methodical and calm. He was no longer the farmer who would skip meals for his son. He was the man who had survived the betrayal and found the strength to save his own life. That night, David lay in his childhood bedroom, the air smelling of old wood and the herbs Jonathan had hung to dry. He stared at the ceiling, the same cracked plaster he had looked at as a boy dreaming of the city. He felt a terror deeper than any business loss, the terror of being truly alone. But beneath the terror, a small, dormant part of him began to stir. He remembered Jonathan's hands, thick, scarred, and capable. He realized that those hands were the only reason he was alive to feel this shame. Jonathan sat on the porch in the dark, wrapped in his new, heavy coat. He watched the snow begin to fall, the white flakes drifting silently onto the driveway. He thought of the night David had called him a servant, and he felt the last remaining shard of that pain melt away. By forcing David to leave, he wasn't acting out of vengeance. He was giving David the only gift left that mattered, the opportunity to become a man who didn't need to lie about his father. As the first light of dawn began to gray the sky, Jonathan entered David's room. He placed a small bag on the bed, a loaf of bread, some dried fruit, and the wooden carving of the oak tree. "It's time," Jonathan said quietly. David stood up, his face pale and eyes swollen, but he didn't argue. He took the bag and followed his father to the front door. They stood on the porch, the air biting and sharp. "Which way do I go?" David asked, looking out at the crossroads at the bottom of the hill. "That is for you to decide," Jonathan replied. "The world is wide, David. You already know how to build a company. Now, go learn how to build a life. Don't come back until you can look at this house and see a home, not a servant's quarters." David nodded slowly. He took a single step down the porch, then paused and turned back. "Thank you for the stew, Dad." Jonathan watched him walk down the driveway, a thin figure disappearing into the morning mist. He stood there until he could no longer hear the sound of David's footsteps on the frozen gravel. Then, Jonathan walked back into his warm, sturdy house and closed the door. He picked up his tools and began to work on his garden plans, a man who had finally settled his debts with the past and was ready to live for the day. He had saved David's life one last time, not with money, but with the cold, honest truth of the earth. The morning mist clung to the valleys of the countryside long after David's figure had vanished beyond the crossroads. Inside the farmhouse, Jonathan moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency that had become the hallmark of his new life. He stoked the embers in the wood stove, the warmth spreading through the kitchen like a slow, steady pulse. For decades, he had lived for a future that existed only in his son's potential, but now, he lived for the tangible reality of the present. The sagging porch was gone, replaced by reinforced beams he had fitted with his own hands. The leaking roof was a memory, covered now by sturdy shingles that defied the autumn rain. He spent the morning in his garden, a patch of earth that had once been purely functional, but now boasted the vibrant colors of winter pansies and the fragrant reach of rosemary bushes. Working the soil felt different now. Before, every seed planted was a calculation of tuition fees and rent payments for a son who looked down on the dirt. Now, the resistance of the earth against his spade felt like a conversation between equals. He was 64 years old, and while the dull ache in his knees reminded him of the price he had paid for his endurance, his mind was clearer than it had ever been during the years of his greatest productivity. In the village, the whispers about Jonathan's cruelty had begun to surface. Word had traveled fast that he had turned away his only son, a man who had returned home broken and begging for mercy. At the local general store, eyes would linger on Jonathan's back as he purchased his modest supplies. Some saw him as a man of steel, others as a father who had finally lost his heart. Jonathan heard the murmurs, but they did not penetrate the wall of his resolve. He knew a truth the villagers did not. Mercy without accountability is merely a stay of execution. To have allowed David to stay, To hide in his childhood bedroom while his father worked the remnants of the farm would have been the ultimate betrayal. It would have confirmed David's belief that he was entitled to the labor of others, even the man he had once called a servant. As winter deepened, Jonathan found a strange sense of companionship in the silence of the house. He read books he had never had time for, philosophical treatises and historical accounts that expanded the boundaries of his world beyond the village borders. He thought often of the night in the city lobby, the cold air conditioning, and the silk-clad stranger who had claimed not to know him. The memory no longer brought a sharp sting of pain. Instead, it served as a lighthouse, a warning of the rocks upon which he had nearly wrecked his soul. He realized that by erasing his father, David had inadvertently given Jonathan permission to find himself. Miles away, in a town small enough to be anonymous but large enough to offer work for those willing to bleed, David was learning the lesson his father had set for him. He had arrived at the construction site with nothing but a small bag and a wooden carving of an oak tree. His hands, once the tools of a CEO, were now blistering and raw from the rough handling of timber and steel. He lived in a shared boarding house that smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool, a far cry from the glass-walled penthouse he had occupied only months before. At night, he would sit on his narrow cot and look at the carving. He traced the intricate lines Jonathan had carved into the wood, and for the first time, he saw the 20 years of sacrifice that each stroke represented. He remembered the farmer who had introduced him as a father, and he wept for the man he had introductions as a servant. David didn't write to Jonathan. He didn't call. He knew that the bridge he had burned in that lobby could not be rebuilt with words. It had to be forged out of the same grit and iron Jonathan had used to build the farm. He worked double shifts, taking the tasks the younger men avoided. He learned to respect the mechanics of a crane, the precision of a level, and the profound dignity of a hard day's labor. He was learning to be a man of character, finding survival on his own merit rather than the blood of an old man. Back at the farmhouse, the first major snowstorm of the year arrived. Jonathan stood by the window, watching the thick, relentless sheets of white seal the world away. He was warm, his stomach was full, and his house was sturdy. But more importantly, he was safe from the expectations of others. He had settled his debts with the past. He had given away the richest soil he owned to settle the loan David had squandered, but in the process, he had reclaimed his own spirit. One evening, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't the frantic, desperate pounding David had brought with him months ago. It was a steady, respectful sound. Jonathan opened the door to find an old friend from the village, a man who had also lost a child to the lure of the city. "I heard you sent him away," the man said, standing on the porch that no longer groaned. "I gave him his life back," Jonathan replied simply. "People say you're a hard man, Jonathan," his friend noted, looking at the clean, organized shelves behind him. "I was a soft man for 60 years, Jonathan said, his voice echoing with the honesty of the earth. "And all it did was turn my son into someone who was ashamed of me. I am finally showing him the respect of treating him like a man who is capable of standing on his own 2 feet. If that makes me hard, then the earth is hard too, but it's the only thing that holds a house up." As his friend left, Jonathan looked out at the crossroads at the bottom of the hill. The mist had cleared, and the moonlight reflected off the frozen gravel. Somewhere out there, David was building a life. Jonathan didn't know if he would ever see the harvest of that labor, and for the first time, he was okay with that uncertainty. He had saved his son's life not with a wire transfer, but with the cold, honest truth. He turned back into his warm, sturdy home and closed the door, a master of his own fate ready to live for the day. The landscape of Jonathan's life had settled into a profound, intentional quiet, a stillness that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. At 65, he had moved beyond the frantic calculations of bushels and bills that had governed his middle years. The farmhouse, now a testament to his own skill and effort, stood firmly against the biting winds of another winter, its reinforced beams holding steady where they had once sagged under the weight of neglect. Jonathan moved through his days with the rhythmic grace of a man who knew exactly who he was, and, more importantly, who he was not. He was no longer the sacrificial shadow of David's ambition. He was a man of the earth who had reclaimed his own spirit from the wreckage of a profound betrayal. In the village, The initial shock of Jonathan's refusal to house his bankrupt son had softened into a grudging respect. The local whispers at the general store had shifted from accusations of cruelty to observations of his quiet strength. Jonathan remained a fixture of the community, but he walked with a different stride now, lighter, yet more grounded. He spent his evenings not staring at a silent telephone, but reading by the steady glow of a lamp he had fixed himself, his mind expanding into the worlds of history and philosophy he had once sacrificed for David's textbooks. He had fully transitioned into his own version of Robert Hayes, finding meaning in what remained: his health, his home, and the integrity of his own word. Far from the village, in the industrial heart of a neighboring province, David was undergoing a transformation of a different kind. The blisters on his hands had hardened into thick, protective calluses, a physical mirror to the changes occurring within his character. He no longer wore the silk and gold of a city CEO. He wore the rugged canvas and steel-toed boots of a laborer. He lived in a room that was little more than a box, but it was a box he paid for with his own sweat. At night, he would sit on the edge of his cot and look at the small wooden carving Jonathan had given him, the replica of the farm's old oak tree. For David, the carving had become a mirror. He saw in its intricate grain the decades of his father's endurance, and in its sharp edges, the cutting cruelty of his own actions in that city lobby. He remembered the way he had introduced his father as a servant, and the memory now burned hotter than the sparks from the welding torch he used during his shifts. He realized that his bankruptcy had not been a stroke of bad luck, but a collapse of a structure built on hollow pride and stolen labor. He was finally learning the dignity of a hard day's work, a lesson Jonathan had tried to teach him for 30 years, but one that could only be truly understood through the hunger of self-reliance. As the deep winter began to thaw, David made a choice. He didn't seek out a new investment or try to charm his way back into a boardroom. Instead, he took the modest savings he had managed to tuck away from his wages, not as capital for a company, but as a down payment on a debt he knew he could never fully repay. He bought a small, sturdy set of tools and a train ticket back to the village. He wasn't returning as a son expecting a handout. He was returning as a man seeking to offer his hands. Jonathan was in his herb garden, clearing the dead stalks of the previous year's lavender, when he heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. He didn't look up immediately. He finished his row with the same methodical patience that had defined his past 3 years. When he finally stood and wiped the dirt from his knees, he saw David standing by the gate. David looked different, older, broader in the shoulders, his face marked by the sun and the reality of physical toil. He wasn't crying this time. His eyes were steady, reflecting a clarity Jonathan had never seen in his son during the years of his city success. "I heard the fences on the north pasture are still in need of repair," David said, his voice carrying the honest, unpolished vowels of the countryside. He held up a worn leather tool bag. "I brought my own equipment. I'd like to work, if you'll have me." Jonathan looked at the man at his gate. He didn't see the CEO, and he didn't see the servant David had tried to make him. He saw a person who had finally begun to understand the weight of a legacy. Jonathan offered his slow, wise smile, a smile that was no longer a mask of hidden hunger, but a true expression of peace. "The north pasture is long," Jonathan replied quietly, "and the work is hard, but the earth is honest." David opened the gate, and for the first time in their lives, he stepped onto the farm not as an heir or a guest, but as a partner. They spent the day working side by side in the crisp spring air. There was very little talk. The communication was in the shared rhythm of the hammer and the tension of the wire. David worked until his back ached and his fingers were numb, but he didn't complain. He found a strange, profound satisfaction in the resistance of the posts and the solidity of the earth. He was learning that character is not something you are given. It is something you build, one post at a time. That evening, they sat on the porch that Jonathan had reinforced with his own hands. The air smelled of damp soil and the first hints of spring growth. Jonathan handed David a cup of tea, and they watched the sunset over the fields Jonathan had saved by selling his richest soil. The loss of that land no longer felt like a tragedy. It felt like a necessary price for the redemption sitting in the chair next to him. "I was a soft man for 60 years, David," Jonathan said, echoing the words he had spoken to his friend months before. "I thought I was protecting you by carrying the world for you. I didn't realize I was stealing your strength." David looked at his father, his eyes filled with a deep, silent gratitude. "You gave me the world once, and I threw it away. Then you gave me the truth, and it saved my life." Jonathan nodded, the moonlight catching the white cotton of his hair. He had survived the collapse of his family only to build something much stronger from the debris. David was finally becoming a man who could look at the dirt and see a foundation rather than a burden. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, awkward quiet of the past. It was a full, resonant silence, the kind that exists between two people who have finally learned to speak the same language, the language of the earth, the language of honesty, and the language of the high price of family. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a master of his own fate, ready for the harvest that was finally his own to reap. He had saved his son's life one last time, not with a wire transfer, but with the courage to let him fall. And in the falling, David had finally learned how to stand. The final harvest arrived not with the roar of heavy machinery or the frantic energy of a city deadline, but with the quiet, rhythmic sound of two men breathing in unison as they worked the soil. Jonathan, now 66, stood at the edge of the remaining garden, watching David finish the last row of the season's planting. The son who had once been a man of silk and gold was now a man of iron and earth. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his frame was lean and powerful, and his eyes held a steady, unwavering light that no boardroom victory could ever provide. David had spent a full year living in the small town nearby, supporting himself entirely through his own labor while spending his weekends helping Jonathan restore what was left of the family legacy. Jonathan adjusted his heavy coat, the one he had purchased when he first decided to live for himself, and felt a profound sense of closure. He was no longer the man who lived in the shadow of another's expectations. He had fully stepped into the identity he had forged in the wake of the ultimate betrayal, a man who was grounded, independent, and clear-eyed. Jonathan had shed the skin of the sacrificial provider to become the architect of truth. He looked at the farmhouse, now sturdy and warm, and knew that its foundation was finally built on something real. David wiped the sweat from his brow and walked toward the porch where Jonathan sat. He didn't ask for a seat. He waited for the silent nod of approval that had become the currency of their new relationship. He sat on the top step, his boots caked in the honest mud of the fields. "The north pasture fences held through the last gale, Dad," David said, his voice deep and resonant with the vowels of the countryside. "And the new herb garden is starting to show green. It's going to be a good year." Jonathan offered his slow, wise smile. "The earth gives back exactly what you put into it, David. No more, no less. It's the only place in the world that doesn't know how to lie." David looked out over the horizon, where the sun was setting in a bruise of purple and gold over the acres Jonathan had once sold to pay for his son's arrogance. The loss of that land no longer felt like a wound. It felt like the price of a hard-won wisdom. "I used to think that being a CEO meant I was the one in control," David whispered, his fingers absently tracing the lines of the small wooden oak carving Jonathan had given him months ago, which he now carried everywhere. "I thought power was measured by how many people you could command or how much money was in a tin box. I was so blind that I couldn't see that the only real power is the ability to look the man in the mirror in the eye." Jonathan nodded, his white hair catching the dying light. "The city lobby was the storm that had to happen, David. It was the moment you tried to erase me, but in doing so, you only succeeded in erasing yourself. You had to become a man with nothing before you could learn how to be a man of character." The silence that followed was full and resonant, a shared space where the ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest. Jonathan thought of the night David had introduced him as a servant, and he realized that the pain of that memory had been completely replaced by the reality of the man sitting next to him. He had saved David's life one last time, not with the life savings he had once drained, but with the cold, honest truth of a closed door. By forcing David to leave and find his own way, Jonathan had given his son the opportunity to build a life that wasn't a lie. As the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Jonathan stood up. His knees ached, a permanent reminder of the decades of labor he had given, but his heart felt light. He placed a thick, calloused hand on David's shoulder, a gesture that was no longer a burden of expectation, but a sign of genuine partnership. "Dinner is ready," Jonathan said quietly. And tomorrow, we have work to do. David stood up, his posture as straight and sturdy as the beams Jonathan had reinforced. Yes, we do, Dad. They walked into the warm, bright kitchen together. The house no longer felt like a monument to sacrifice. It felt like a home. Jonathan had settled his accounts with the past, and David had begun to earn his place in the future. They ate a meal they had grown with their own hands, talking of the crops and the weather, their conversation grounded in the tangible honesty of the earth. Jonathan looked across the table and saw not the stranger from the lobby, but the son he had finally managed to raise properly. He had survived the high price of family and discovered that the strongest bridges are the ones built only after everything else has fallen apart. He was Robert Hayes, a master of his own fate, and he was finally ready for the harvest. He had taught David that mercy without accountability is an insult, and in doing so, he had saved them both. As he closed the door for the night and checked the latches, Jonathan felt the last remaining chill of the betrayal melt away. He was safe, he was warm, and he was whole. The world was wide, and the earth was hard, but for the first time in 66 years, Jonathan knew that he was standing on solid ground. He had lived through the betrayal to see the redemption, and that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. He went to bed and slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who had no more debts to pay, leaving the dawn to bring whatever work was necessary for the day.